Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com.
Welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast. My name is Carolyn Woodard. I'm the host. I wanted to say a little bit about just acknowledging that the nonprofit sector is going through some pretty challenging times right now. So I really appreciate everyone being with us on this podcast. And I'm very excited today to be here with Shauna Dillavou. She is a cybersecurity and online safety expert and the co-founder of Brightlines. Shauna, I wanted to start by asking you to introduce yourself and tell me about your background. So I'm particularly interested to know how you got involved in cybersecurity, which is such a male-dominated space.
I came to Washington out of college in Washington, D.C., and I worked at some nonprofit doing, some association doing communications work. And I got into graduate school for urban planning at USC. I know all these degrees I never ended up using. My undergrad degree is in Spanish, whatever. I got into this program at USC. I moved to Los Angeles. But while I was there, I went on a summer trip to Beijing. And I thought it was such a fascinating place. From the built environment perspective, right? From the way that they were building it, abandoned things that no one was ever going to use or never got finished. It was so wild. And all the politics that were involved, even on the local level, having to take a local minister out for drinks and get him super hammered and sing karaoke until 2 a.m. or 5 a.m. And that's how you want to deal. It just seemed bonkers to me. And I loved it. So I wanted to get back. And when I finished graduate school, when I was finishing up, I applied for a fellowship called the National Security Education Program, Boren Fellowship, and I got it. So I went to China on this fellowship to do research and to study Chinese. But part of the requirement of the fellowship was that I would come home and work in national security for the U.S. government. So the summer before I left for China, I'd come back out here and worked for a now defunct group that did open source intelligence. OSINT, they call it, or open source intelligence. Think about it like you're standing listening to a couple's, a group talk at a party. And what you're gathering just standing there listening is OSINT. If you were to ask a question and move the conversation in a way, that would be human intelligence or human. So our job at that time, and this is 2007, 8, 9, when keep in mind that Twitter launched in 2007. So it was a time when everybody was sharing everything online. And we were really just sifting through just thousands of pieces of data every day to define trends in different places. And at the time I had Spanish, right? So I was looking at Spanish-speaking countries. And when I came back from my fellowship, I worked on China and then on Mexico. And really thought about drug cartels or worked monitored drug cartel activities. And while I was there, I got to work with the DEA to help them identify the U.S. side of cartel operations. It's a lot more nuanced than that, but using the methods we use today at Brightlines in reverse. So I was doing targeting and investigation of people, but I knew how we could find them. And so 4 years ago, when I started Brightlines, I took those methods and turned them on their head, right? To see how we could find our clients and what we could do to remove the information.
So can you talk a little bit about the kinds of threats that nonprofit personnel face online or in person?
Yeah, let me explain. So nonprofits have been going through it. I would say they're on the front lines. Y'all are on the front lines of being targeted. It wasn't until this Brian Thompson was killed in New York last month, was it already? That other sectors have really started to understand that this affects them, that physical security concerns affect them. We don't have to explain that to nonprofit clients. So along the way, I've been working for a long time in progressive spaces, but in nonprofits. I founded a nonprofit in 2013. And ran that through 2017. I understand all of the different transparency things that open up our data and our personal information to scrutiny, to FOIA, to different transparency laws. So between that and nonprofits really in the civil society sector writ large, being out in front, fighting fascism and like the erosion of democratic norms and a democracy full stop, it's been nonprofits who are the most targeted. So I founded this company with the intention that, I guess with the understanding that if a person couldn't participate in our democracy, if they couldn't advocate for something that they believed in, if they couldn't show up to vote because they were scared, if they couldn't run for office, they couldn't be out in front as a public figure because they couldn't afford the security, then we weren't living in a democracy any longer. And so I founded this company for nonprofits. The threats that they're experiencing, of course, like anybody else, like there's going to be cybersecurity problems, right? There's cybersecurity threats. There's like infiltration and of networks and phishing and other kinds of social engineering. Basic password management is still a problem because you have a resource issue always, right? That's how we like to keep our nonprofits, like begging, silly. And yet I would say nonprofits have been the canary in the coal mine when it comes to doxing, which is what the problem that we fight. Is it useful to explain what doxing is?
Oh, yes, I think so. Yeah. I mean, I can jump in and just say, when we think about cybersecurity for our clients, a lot of what we think about and put in place are those protections for the organization. So wire fraud or phishing attempts that are going to get access to the organization's data or research, that sort of thing. Or usually it's financial, like they just want to get you to wire the money to their bank account instead of the one you're supposed to spend it to. Yeah. But that was what I thought was so interesting talking with you about the personal safety and personal data of staff at nonprofits. So can you talk a little bit about what happens if, like your advocacy organization and you're the executive director, so you're out there speaking on your organization's behalf, or maybe you're working in a country like you said, in China or another country where there are state-sponsored actors who want to know your network, your, people that you're in contact with. So, can you talk a little bit about what are those types of threats, personal
Yeah,
threats?
you bet. And you know what? The thing I didn't mention about being a woman in a male-dominated space is that you really realize your superpowers as being gendered as a woman, right? Like the things that you're trained to do on the basis of your gender. I don't know that I would, sounds horrible. I don't know that I would trust a man for my security because I don't think he has ever experienced what it's like to walk down a street and know where everybody is and be afraid. I don't think he's ever gone on a run and worried that he would be raped. Like I think about that. I think about that all the time. Think about that for my two young daughters all the time. And it's a thing that we don't even realize we're thinking about. And so it's not just like a physical concern, right? I think women, we've been genderized to like think about it for our communities, for our families, how to take risks in ways that are useful or that uplift other people. It's security really ought to be like a woman dominated place. Or, as I would argue, the more intersectional the identity, the broader the attack surface. If you have a BIPOC woman, a Black woman especially, like that seems to me to be the person whose lived experience is going to inform best what security methods you want to use. I would never tell a Black woman that she's safe if she doesn't feel safe. Like she's gonna know. Do you know what I mean? So, okay, but getting back to your question at hand, what was it?
So what is doxing?
So doxing comes from this like hacker speak, I would bet, from the 90s for dropping documents. So dropping docs, meaning that you are sharing someone else's personal information, probably personally identifying or identifiable information. I would add to it that the intent of a dox is to create terror for the person whose information is shared, and to incite others to take action, to show up, to make contact with them. We have this escalation we show of like how when like there are indicators that someone's getting close to coming to see you in person, right? So the intention of doxing is to incite others to make a phone call or send a text or send a DM or an email, something that's less traceable, and then start to take physical action, right? Show up at a place. So, with the intent of harming, right? Of creating terror and harming.
Yeah.
Okay, so in any organization, but I would argue especially in a nonprofit, people are your biggest asset. It takes a long time to find the right people. When you find them, you want to keep them. They're there for often ideological reasons, right? They're there because they believe in the mission, the vision, the values of the organization. Otherwise, they could go somewhere else and get paid more. They're obviously not in it just for the cash. So often you have folks who've stayed a long time, who have a lot of institutional knowledge, who care greatly. And those aren't things you can just create in for-profit companies. That takes a lot of effort. So you want to protect your people. Now, a lot of the issues that nonprofits cover these days have suddenly become controversial. How is it that like Catholic Charities of Southwest Ohio is a controversial thing is beyond me. But they, like any Catholic Charities organization chapter, are helping refugees in Springfield, Ohio. Helping refugees was like Christ's work, right? Which is what this organization intends to do. Somehow that became a controversial thing. And the organization itself, its work was controversial because it was helping a group of refugees. But an attacker in the United States on US soil isn't necessarily going to have the knowledge to go after their security, right? Their information, like attack their systems. And that's also not gratifying to them. So what they'll do is find someone to target as a scapegoat for the organization, right? So that tends to be folks who are out in front, who are the public facing figures, the executive directors, the folks whose names, the board members might be on a 990, right? Or they're the spokesfolks who are out in front, who are having the conversations, sharing information on social media, whose name gets attached. And if it's not those folks, it's going to be, generally speaking, a young woman presenting person, generally of intersectional identity, that gets targeted. Because women should know better. They should know their place. And any person of color also ought to know her place, right? If you're non-binary or trans, forget about it. Like that's the target. That's the target. No one, it gets so easy to not defend the more vulnerable, I guess, in that sense. We're more willing to let trans folks be the target. So what does that usually look like? In a pattern of escalation, often the client wouldn't be aware for a long time. The person wouldn't be aware that it's happening. Now, I would say,
unless you're in those spaces, like if you're
unless
on
you're monitoring
Telegram and their chat and they're all
right?
talking about you, but you wouldn't be in there because you're just a normal nonprofit staff person doing your nonprofit
I
things.
don't know too many nonprofits that have the budget to pay for one of those threat intelligence services to monitor their people all the time. That stuff's expensive. And also, for the most part, it's not going to produce anything. And who knows if it's even any quality? We've talked to 4 of them to partner with. It has taken 4 to find one that we're like, this might work. Because you have all of these models interacting and behind it to like understand sentiment, and they're not built necessarily for like nonprofit folks. They're not necessarily built for ideologically motivated attackers, and that's who we're focused on, right? And they're built more to understand trends, like for a brand, and not for individual people, the targeting of individual people. So, and I think this is something that actually I really want to make sure I speak about. We built this for ideologically motivated attackers. We built our tool Brightlines this way because we understand, and I would say as like a person who presents as a woman, who's a woman, I understand what it feels like when you tell someone no and they won't stop. So a dogged attacker, right? Like I feel like I don't have to make this case to most other folks who present like I do. An ideologically motivated attacker is a dogged attacker. They will not stop. I've seen other tools that are like, we will look at 4 pages of your Google search results. And I'm like, LOL, why bother? You need to look at 200 pages. You need to look at every result because I know the attacker will, right? So for a lot of what we're doing in nonprofit work these days, especially in what has suddenly become progressive when it's, I think, just really humanity, just human focused, right? the work that we're doing is somehow controversial, and there needs to be someone who pays for it. And I think it's the same kind of ideologically motivated attacker who would go after a staff person. Yeah, go
You
ahead.
said that you have like this research on the types of things, how you know someone is getting close to you. So if a staff person or an executive or a board member of a nonprofit or anyone else listening has received threats, what are the usual first threats and what are the usual first steps that they should take?
Yeah. Now, yeah, what that looks like, I think today you don't have to worry that you wouldn't know. There's not so much hiding about it. I mean, you'll see people get doxxed on Twitter because no one's going to stop them.
Well, and once your phone number gets out, I know
It's
that
really
Sandy
hard.
Hook families, like it was the first weekend, people started leaving them death threats on their phone numbers, on their home phones.
Who was this?
The Sandy Hook families, like the worst thing in the world has just happened to you. And the next weekend, people are calling your phone number. Yeah, it's just terrible.
I'm so disgusted.
I know. So if you are a staff person that is, suddenly become known, that you are associated with something that has suddenly become controversial, perhaps, then you'll know pretty quickly
I would
that
say you'll know pretty
people
quickly.
are threatening you.
I mean, Marianne Budd, the bishop of the Episcopalian Church, she was
Right.
doxxed the next day on
It was
Twitter.
that evening, yeah.
Yeah, that evening.
Yeah.
On a mainstream social media channel. So they'll either reach, I think the gloves are off because no one's stopping them in terms of law enforcement at the state, local, federal level. And the platforms have washed their hands of this. They're not interested in doing any kind of content moderation any longer. They don't have to. Section 230 doesn't make them. And like nobody up here in Washington is making them either. So yeah, I guess we're just gonna, yes. So you will know now.
But what should you do when
Yeah,
you,
I think it's
because
really
it's
easy to freak
terrifying, like you
out.
said, you receive
Yeah.
that first phone call and you're terrified. What do you do?
So the first phone calls, okay, so we had this case where a client came to us this week or last week and they were like, hey, my partner fired someone from this organization and then he sent her a nasty note. What do we do? We're worried, right? So we went and kind of investigated the person online and like kind of got an idea for who he was. And then I asked very specifically, did he send it to her personal email or to her work email? It was to her work email. And I was like, well, he didn't go do any digging on her. He's not demonstrating any signs that he's trying to bring the harm to her home. Now, if they come to your personal phone number, it's also really easy to find that. Like maybe she'd already shared it with him, right? Or to your personal, I would put social media first. Like if it's an online only source, it's like, no, that's awful and I'm sorry, but also not, social media. And then if it comes to, yeah, something that you're near, your email, your phone number, if your loved ones start to hear, get messages, texts, phone calls, emails, then it's clear that the person is more interested in creating harm. It's hard to say at that stage, you want to make sure that you're safe in your home, right? If you're worried that something is escalating and happening and like more and more, you're getting more and more phone calls. So there was like a FOIA dump of emails after the 2020 election that involved a client. And he'd made some like just funny remark to a colleague of his who was an election worker, a state employee. And these guys made hay of it when they got that email dump and went after him. And over the course of a weekend, it blew up, right? It was like more texts, more phone calls, more and more and more. It was really escalating and then it just stopped. So as it was escalating, I was like, get your family. He had 2 little kids. I was like, get your family and just get out of the house for a weekend. Because we can't know who knows your address right now, and we can't get it taken down in 2 days. We can't move it that fast, right? So just leave and give yourself peace of mind for a minute. But yeah, if you start to, I think the volume, the rhetoric, if it's a lot of the same rhetoric, if it's like somebody just copy pasted, that feels like a bot attack that someone paid for. And I'd be less concerned than if you had all these unique different people saying things to you. And then if it's a person, say on social media or that you've discovered, like has found you and is sharing information about you, and they're a level of influencer, right? Say they have a couple 100,000 or a million or millions of followers. I would take that risk far more seriously to some extent, right? If you find somebody who's threatening you physically and he has 1,000 followers, that's still problematic, right? I would take that very seriously too. And anytime someone crosses that line, I think about this like the lethality index that they talk about in domestic violence. After a certain point, so the lethality index, they talk about if a person has ever tried to choke you, he's 7 times more likely to kill you. So I think about this like this. If someone has uttered the words, I will kill you, or I will harm you, or I will harm your children, I would take that very seriously, even if they don't. Because a guy showed up to come at ping pong with some guns once because he heard a rumor that was where children were being trafficked. Like some folks don't need much motivation. And so if they've made those kinds of comments, I would take that very seriously. What do you do? Depends on your comfort level with your local constabulary. Are you comfortable calling the police? Probably, maybe. As an organization, what you can do is support your staff person. If you can help them get out of their house, if they need to do that, right? If you can help them assess where they are, if you can if they can relinquish some control of those accounts to have help, like removing messages if there's a lot of hate flooding in that way, or documenting messages. If someone can take over support, with law enforcement or run point with law enforcement on behalf of the employee, I think there's a lot that can be done as that situation begins to escalate. And of course, like everyone should use a data broker scrubbing tool. We use Canary, starts with a K. I think everyone would benefit from that. We work more in prevention. So as something is happening, it's really hard to say, like, do this, this, and this. There's not a formula unless you feel confident or you really are worried that something is going to physically happen to you. But yeah, I can talk about prevention all day long.
I was going to say, this is probably a good moment to say, like, what does your company do? What's the service that you provide? What are, what are the range of things that you can do to, as I understand it, your company for the most part is trying to clean the online space of how to find you personally.
It's so hard to, yes, we're looking for your risky personal information and how you can manage it, ameliorate it, remove it, right? So everyone, and we built our company to be, I guess I would call it, like, we've built it on a trauma sensitive framework. Like the entire premise of the company, all of our processes, and then our ultimate product is like, it's about presenting the information and having the client make informed decisions. The idea is that this returns agency to someone who's experiencing a trauma. And so it helps, it's sensitive to that, right? Trauma helps someone who's really going through it. What we do is gather information about you that we can find online and understand how easy it is to find your home address first. Other things folks like to protect are the names of their partners or their children, different parts of their identity. Their parents, generally, if they're elderly. They like to protect the ways in. So sometimes they don't always know this, but the ways to get that information, your personal email addresses, your personal cell phone number, your relative locations. It can be really easy to pinpoint which Jack Smith you're looking for if you know that he lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma at one point, right? And it's a name like that like, is this a Jack Smith I want to find? So things that may not be overt pieces of like personal identifying information. We always like to say that PII is more than your social security number. It's a lot more, right? It's like your image. It's so easy to find so much about people with reverse image searching and facial recognition these days. It's your date of birth. It's your political affiliations. It's who you donate to, right? That is out there on every FEC filing, apparently known to man. So what we will do is search across about a dozen databases, from things as easy as like data brokers to anywhere that your accounts have been hacked and shown up on the dark web, where you have like orphaned accounts, your facial recognition. We'll search with a bunch of Boolean terms across public search engines, so like Google, and then we go and look very hard at public records, because we understand that public records are the source data for data brokers, whether they get those records by buying them from our states and cities and counties, or if they scrape online databases, which I think also happens quite a bit because localities don't know how to set that stuff up so that it can't be scraped. Or if they do know now, they didn't when they set it up, and there's no budget to do that now. So, all right. So in looking at all of that data, we look for the things that are like the bright red flags, like, oh, on whitepages.com, I found your address and your name. So we probably need to remove that, right? But we're also going to say like, oh, this is your partner's name. Oh, I found his address on, the voter roll for your state, even though you've been removed because you're a federal judge. It's easy to Google and find your husband's name and your grown child's name, and they're both registered to vote there. Like, we would want to know, like, oh, I know your date of birth from your bio, right? And then you talk about in this article growing up in Ohio, and I found on a data broker that these are your parents' names, so now I can order your birth certificate. So we want to look at like the entirety of the data that's out there and what picture it tells about folks, and then what we can do about it.
Because I think for a lot of people, like, I wouldn't know how to take my information down from most of the platforms I use and databases that are out there. So,
yeah, the removal piece is so challenging. There's no privacy framework.
yeah.
And even in California and Virginia and the states that have them, they're really focused on consumers, on like companies having consumer data, which is important. But I mean, even after CCPA was enforced, California's DMV was selling its database. I mean, the US change of address database, they don't sell the data, and they'll tell you over and over, we don't sell your data. They sell licenses to the database.
Yeah.
So they're giving the data away still.
Yeah.
Like, you've trusted USPS to like, what? Like, how USPS, you're selling my information. Cool. Okay. So there are a lot of these kind of dark patterns and weird ways dishonest ways that they get around this. But for the most part, a privacy framework doesn't cover our public records. And short of data brokers removing your information for a while, they might just pop it right back up, or they might buy another data set and put it back on. They're not going to honor that request forever. It feels very whack-a-mole. Yeah.
So you were telling me that your service is a subscription because it's this ongoing, like it'll pop up again a month later.
Yeah.
So, and I think you told me it's relatively expensive because even though it just takes, a moment for some keyboard warrior to figure out your parents' address, it takes a really long time and a lot of labor to take down that information.
Yeah. I mean, yes, listen, a couple of things, like the timing is long because data brokers they drag their feet. They don't want to remove information. It's not their top priority. Get that. But also, we often advocate for people shifting their public records in legal ways, right? And that takes time because you're dealing with bureaucracies.
And
So
lawyers.
if you move your home into a revocable trust, that can cost a few $1,000s. You have to wait for a lawyer to do this, to do that. You have to make some tough decisions and have conversations. And then you record it. And that recordation takes the time that it takes. So it can take months. It took me a few months to get my house into a trust.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's, that's where people's lives are busy. This isn't a top priority until it is.
Right. And I think you said when we were talking earlier that one of the things a nonprofit can do in that situation to protect their staff who are under this harassment would be to work with their funders to help provide that security or safety protection.
Yeah, yes. We've seen we've seen a surge in funders understanding that the movement will die if the people can't do it. And the people can't do it. Choosing between their family's safety and their job isn't a choice. So we've seen funders, there are a couple of different funds that will do emergency support or security support. I think a Democracy Protection Network, the RASI Fund, the RASI RASI Fund, those folks will help nonprofits specifically. And I would imagine that most funders that are already funding you, because that can be a faster way to get funding in the door for security, they understand the problem of doxing because it's happened to so many of us now.
And I'm sure a lot of people at foundations and such, if they're funding something that has suddenly become controversial, like you said, they may ask.
Listen, we've talked to, I mean, we have clients among a number of foundations, and I don't know, they'll say to us when we've talked to them in the past, now it's less of a conversation, but they'll say, oh no, the grantees need to bring their request to us. We're not going to tell them what they need. Great approach. And they may not know that this is an issue yet and that they're likely to be targeted. So if you're hearing this and you're thinking, wow, I really don't want this happening ahead of like whatever announcement we make for our next, whatever PR blitz or whatever campaign we're doing next, I'm worried about this, it's a good time to start that conversation with the funder.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I think also in my past experience with some volunteer activity too, like I know it's kind of cliche to say it's generational, but like being in touch with the younger staff at your organization, because they are in a lot of those online spaces that you might not be on, like even just on Twitter, X, like if that's part of their job and their advocacy is to know what's going on in that social media sphere around your issue or the country that you're working in or all of those different things. They're going to be like your eyes and ears and hear things that are happening sooner than maybe some of your older executives
Right. And it'll
are
be the
going to know.
executives who are more likely to get targeted.
Yeah, that's true too.
It's
Yeah.
so interesting too with folks at that level. There's like a kind of detachment that we see where they're like, oh, I can handle it. It's like, okay, well, maybe you have a higher risk tolerance because you have a great alarm system and that you trust your local police and that you have a dog, that you have all these physical security measures in place. You might even have a driver. Like if you're an executive at a certain level, you're not super concerned about it for yourself. And I think we often have to remind folks like, well, how do your children feel? Like, how does your partner feel? How do the rest of the staff feel? Because if they can't get you, executive, they're going to go after someone else on staff. And that person may not be as well resourced and definitely won't have the privileges of both middle age and wealth that a person at an executive level would probably have.
We talked at the beginning about the different threats that men and women and Black women face in this sphere, and that nonprofit staff are majority women in most sectors that nonprofits work in. Do you have any kind of like final thoughts on that gendered nature of this threat at this moment? And do you have any takeaways like about the most important things to keep yourself safe? Like, should you just not be online? What?
Oh, I mean, that ship sailed.
I
Wow.
know, right?
I know. Yeah, I remember early on. So I got to know the folks who were targeted by Gamergate back in 2014, and the police.
That's right.
Yeah, the police said to them, like, can't you just get offline? And they were like, are you daft? Like, really? And now it's so much worse, I would say to women,
Can't you just not eat food?
right, stop breathing the air. What?
Uh-huh.
I mean, recently I found that my information was attached to all of these public records that I had nothing to do with. It's just that's the decision the city made. It's like, how? Never consent, never informed, whatever. So I'm going to say this, I think, as bluntly as I'm allowed. You know better. You know best. Take what you know, women, that you know because of your lived experience, particularly women and folks of color and women of color, and apply that here. If something doesn't feel right, that's your intuition, or literally that's your lived experience. That's the lived experience of your mommies and your grandmoms and like your aunties and everyone who's told you your whole life this is not okay. So like if you don't like rideshare because you're getting in a stranger's car, then don't do it. That is weird, right? Like, why do we do that? We don't think about it. If you don't like the way that the dating app is structured because you can't change your location, don't use it. Yeah. So, and if folks want to give you a hard time because you carry a flip phone, like that's really fine. That's fine. You need to protect yourself. I would say we have learned to navigate the physical spaces throughout our lives. From the time I have two little girls and like I see them navigating physical spaces. Yeah. I see them thinking about it. And I see them seeing what they can and can't get away with, right? Yeah. You've known since you were able to walk really how you can do it. And so that knowledge applies. It's just a matter of I think understanding that the streets are virtual.
Yeah.
But the same knowledge applies. I'm hoping, Carolyn, I'm like writing a book proposal about this now. So I'm
Okay.
hoping to have this guide on the market, the proposal on the market next in March. But I'm hoping to have this book next year published about how women, like a guide really for women
Yeah.
to survive.
Because I feel like that's what's changed. I have friends who've worked in very like just on the surface controversial areas, like, providing escort services at abortion clinics or working on the issue of gun violence, which is a very gendered advocacy issue. And some of the people who work for those nonprofits go into it knowing I'm going to have a security detail. I'm going to have to live in a house that no one has the address of because of the nature of my work. But what's happened in the last, 5-10 years is this change of you're not doing anything controversial and you're not the kind of person who would seek out that kind of job. And then in an instant, your whole life is changed because something that often doesn't have anything to do with you, like you passed a mint to your mom on election night. And suddenly, it's
You
all
were getting paid
over.
whatever, $15 an hour to count votes. You passed
No
it to your
kidding.
mom, and now you own Rudy Giuliani's penthouse.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah,
God for that.
which is,
But
cold comfort.
yeah, I'm sure it matters little. It's not.
No kidding.
So yeah, I think, oh God, it can be any of us, any time. And I think what we're learning is it's not about what you're wearing,
Yeah,
I mean, I'm always happy to talk about our work. It's so important. And also ask to uplift, like, that this is a wildly gendered problem.
yeah, it really is. Yeah,
It plays into all of our institutional bias,
yeah.
all of our.
Just every cop who's like, oh, don't worry, they're probably not going to act on that.
Yeah, can't you just get offline?
It doesn't make me feel better to think they're
No,
maybe probably not going to.
no,
Yeah.
no, it actually doesn't make me any safer. No, I mean, the evidence shows over and over that it's women cops that de-escalate situations. It's women politicians who send more money home to their districts. It's like, it's women intelligence analysts who get the information, right? Like, how are we still calling these soft skills? Get
Maybe your
raped.
book will help the politicians who are so far behind on understanding this.
I think also the big tech folks, like who was building our tech and on based on what assumptions and like how, like I think about that. I was just thinking about all of these, like the gig economy and this disruptive economy and all that it's done is like built this really tentative trust between absolute strangers coming into your home or you getting into their car or them shopping for you, but they know your name and your address and like
Mhm.
what you look like. And
Mhm.
no one, I think about grandmothers being like, what are you doing? Like, these are the things that you've been told your whole life you may not do. And here you are doing it, right?
Yeah.
And everyone's doing it. And
Yeah.
so who designed these systems and on what basis? Those guys don't have fear of a stranger harming them.
No.
But we do, I think about that the way that tech gets built all the time. Like it's built with a very different use case in mind. And we are not consulted. If you built technology for Black women, everything would be safer for everybody. Do you know?
And it would work. And it would be a party.
It'd probably be cheaper. It would be good looking,
It
but
would be awesome. All right. Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much for your time today, Shauna. This was just such a fascinating conversation and unfortunate that it's really needed, but thank you so much for sharing your expertise and good luck with the book. I look
thank
forward to
you.
it. And a lot of people listening could use it.
Okay, well, I'll keep that as motivation. Keep at it.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for doing this with me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Yeah, glad to.
Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com, so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.